A hand. Over a mouth. For less than 2 seconds. That is all it takes now to be sent off the pitch at the World Cup. Not a tackle, not a handball, not violence of any kind. A hand raised to a mouth during an argument with an opponent. And on June 20th, 2026, at Levi's Stadium in California, it actually happened. A Paraguayan midfielder said something to a Turkish defender. He covered his mouth while he said it. The referee reached for his pocket. Red card. The stadium did not fully understand what it had just witnessed. Commentators paused. Players from both benches stood frozen for a second, trying to process what had just been enforced in front of them, live at the World Cup, for the very first time. Because this is not a rule anyone has ever seen before in the history of football. There is no precedent, there is no equivalent. You cannot find a comparable law in any major sport on earth that sends a player off the field for the way they hold their hand while they are talking. And yet here it is, written into the laws of the game. Approved unanimously. Enforced for the first time in a World Cup group match. And it has a name that everyone in football now knows, the Vinícius Law. This is the story of how one gesture, repeated by one player in one match 4 months before the tournament began, ended up rewriting the rulebook of the sport's biggest stage, and why right now, players across this World Cup are looking down at their own hands during arguments, wondering if the most natural reflex in football has quietly become the most dangerous one. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to February 17th, 2026. Lisbon, Portugal. A Champions League knockout playoff between Benfica and Real Madrid. Vinícius Júnior had just scored. Real Madrid were ahead 1-0. And in the moments after the goal, in the kind of confrontation that happens in football matches a dozen times a night, and is usually forgotten within minutes, Benfica's Gianluca Prestianni approached Vinícius and said something. Nobody outside that moment knows exactly what, because Prestianni covered his mouth with his shirt while he said it. Because the one piece of evidence that mattered most, the words themselves, had been physically obscured from view at the exact moment they were spoken. His word against mine. Unprovable, unresolvable. The most advanced broadcast technology in the history of football, dozens of camera angles, lip-reading specialists, slow-motion replay, defeated by a single hand raised to a mouth. That gap between what may have happened and what could be proven is where the Vinícius Law was born. FIFA President Gianni Infantino did not wait long to respond. The day after the IFAB discussed the issue in Cardiff, Wales, in early March, Infantino went on Sky News and said something that stunned a portion of the football world. If a player covers his mouth and says something, and this has a racist consequence, then he has to be sent off. Obviously, there must be a presumption that he has said something he shouldn't have said, otherwise he wouldn't have had to cover his mouth. A presumption of guilt, said by the president of FIFA. About a gesture, not an action. About what a player did. Infantino went further still. I simply do not understand, he said. If you don't have something to hide, you don't hide your mouth when you say something. That's it, as simple as that. That sentence is the one that has followed this rule through every press conference, every pundit panel, and every locker room conversation since. Because it assumes something football has never assumed before, that privacy itself, on a football pitch during a heated moment, is evidence of wrongdoing. On April 28, 2026, in Vancouver, the International Football Association Board made it official. 2 new measures approved unanimously. Players who walk off the pitch in protest at a refereeing decision would now receive a straight red card, and players who cover their mouth, arm, hand, or jersey while confronting an opponent would receive the same. It would debut at the World Cup. This World Cup, the one happening right now. And the football world did not know, in the weeks that followed, exactly how to feel about it. Because on paper, the intention is impossible to argue with. Football has a racism problem that has not gone away. Vinícius himself has been a target of repeated, documented racial abuse throughout his career in Spain, incidents that produce statements, investigations, stadium closures, and very little actual change in what happens to players of color on European pitches. If hiding your mouth has become a tactic for avoiding accountability, then removing the ability to hide your mouth removes the tactic. That is the argument FIFA is making, and it is not a frivolous one. But here's what happened the moment the rule met an actual football match. Players talk on the pitch constantly. Hands near faces, shirts pulled up to wipe sweat in the middle of a sentence. Defensive gestures, exhausted gestures, frustrated gestures. Gestures that have nothing to do with concealment, and everything to do with the simple physical reality of grown men breathing hard. And then came June 20th. Levi's Stadium. Turkey versus Paraguay. Miguel Almiron, Paraguay's midfielder, became embroiled in a heated exchange with Turkish defender Mert Mulder. During the confrontation, Almiron was seen speaking to Mulder while partially covering his mouth with his hand. VAR flagged it immediately. Referee Ivan Barton reviewed the footage, and the red card came out. The first enforcement of the Vinícius Law at a World Cup. Live, in a group stage match that millions were watching. A player sent off, not for what he did to an opponent's body, but for the position of his hand while he spoke. The reaction was instant, and it was loud, because nobody in that stadium, and nobody watching at home, could say with certainty what Almiron had actually said. The rule does not require proof of what was said. It requires only the gesture. The presumption Infantino had described months earlier, the idea that concealment itself is sufficient evidence, had just been applied in real time on the world's biggest stage to send a player off a World Cup pitch. Paraguay were furious. The broadcast cut to their bench, where players were visibly stunned, some gesturing toward the officials in disbelief, trying to understand what had just been enforced against their teammate. And across social media, the reaction split immediately into two furious camps that have not stopped arguing since. One side pointed to the obvious justification. If the rule had existed in February, the world would know exactly what Prestianni said to Vinícius. The ambiguity that let an alleged racist incident go unresolved would not have been possible. Hiding your mouth would carry an immediate, unavoidable consequence. That is worth something. That is worth a great deal to players who have spent years being targeted by abuse that goes unpunished, because it cannot be proven. The other side asked a question that football has never had to ask before. What happens to the player who is innocent? What happens to the defender who pulls his shirt over his mouth out of pure exhausted instinct in the 88th minute of a World Cup match, says nothing more offensive than complaining about a foul, and gets sent off anyway, because the gesture itself is now the crime? Because that is precisely what the rule does. It does not require FIFA to prove what was said. It does not require evidence of discriminatory language. It requires only the covering of the mouth during a confrontation. The presumption of guilt that Infantino described is not a metaphor. It is the literal mechanism of the law. A red card in football is the most severe in-game punishment that exists. It is the disciplinary equivalent of a violent tackle, a deliberate handball on the goal line, denying an obvious goal-scoring opportunity. The most serious offenses football recognizes. Alongside those offenses sits a hand gesture made during an argument, with no requirement that anything discriminatory was actually proven to have been said. Pundits across multiple broadcasts have raised the same concern from different angles. The rule conflates two entirely different categories of behavior: the deliberate concealment of genuinely abusive language, and the completely unconscious, habitual gestures that footballers make every single time they are out of breath, frustrated, or simply talking with their hands the way humans naturally do. A defender wiping sweat from his face mid-sentence and a player deliberately hiding racist language behind a jersey are not the same act. But under this rule, a referee in real time, under pressure, with VAR reviewing in slow motion, has to decide which one just happened, in the span of 1 or 2 seconds, with a World Cup match hanging in the balance. Get it right, and football has closed a genuine loophole that has allowed abuse to go unpunished for years. Get it wrong, and a player's tournament, a player's match, a player's reputation is ended by a gesture that meant nothing at all. And there is no way, currently, for anyone watching to know in advance which one is about to happen. That uncertainty is what is changing the way players are behaving on the pitch right now, in real time, during this tournament. Footage from training sessions and warm-up matches in the days following the rule's confirmation showed players consciously, visibly, adjusting their own habits. Hands kept deliberately away from faces during arguments. A new performative awareness of where your own hands are, even in moments of genuine emotional intensity, even when nothing remotely discriminatory is being said. Football has never asked players to think about their hands like this. Not during a tackle, not during a celebration. During an argument, the most human, least controlled moment in any match, players are now being asked to perform self-monitoring in real time, knowing that one wrong gesture, however innocent, could end their afternoon. Some have called this exactly what football needed: a long overdue mechanism that finally gives racism nowhere to hide on the pitch, literally. Vinicius himself has been a consistent, vocal advocate for stronger anti-discrimination enforcement throughout his career, and has described the gesture of concealment as cowardice in its own right, regardless of what specific words are spoken. Others have called it the most dangerous precedent introduced into the laws of the game in a generation. Not because the intention is wrong, but because the mechanism punishes appearance rather than substance. It does not ask what was said. It asks how the hand was positioned while it was said. And that is a standard that has never existed in football, or in most systems of justice anywhere. Because punishing the appearance of guilt rather than the proof of an offense inverts the basic principle that consequences should follow from what actually happened, not from what a gesture might suggest happened. The bigger question this World Cup is now forced to confront is whether this rule, introduced with genuinely good intentions after a genuinely painful incident, is capable of being applied consistently across 48 teams, dozens of referees, different cultures, different match temperatures, and the split-second chaos of live competitive football. Miguel Almiron's red card in California will not be the last application of the Vinícius Law at this tournament. It is very likely only the first. And every time it happens again, the same two questions will follow it around the stadium, through the broadcast, into the post-match press conference, and across every football platform on earth. What did he actually say? And does it matter anymore whether anyone can prove it? Because that is the trade football has now made, knowingly, deliberately, unanimously, at the highest level of the sport's governance. A trade between certainty and protection. Between proof and presumption. Between the world potentially never knowing what was said in Lisbon in February, and the world potentially ending a player's World Cup over a gesture that meant nothing at all. Both of those futures are now permanently written into the laws of the game. What do you think? Is the Vinícius Law the rule football has needed for years to finally confront hidden abuse? Or has FIFA, in trying to solve one injustice, created the conditions for a new one? Leave it in the comments. These are the conversations this channel exists for.